Before this story begins, imagine a man who hasn't heard a woman's voice in years and a girl who has survived by learning not to trust anyone. One quiet evening on a forgotten ranch, a single whisper shattered that silence and changed two lives forever. This is not just a Western story of dust and distance, but a human story of loneliness, choice, and unexpected connection. If stories like this move you, take a second to subscribe, share this video with someone who loves powerful frontier tales, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's start the video. The sun was sinking low when Elias Carter pulled hard on the reins, his horse stopping as if it too had sensed that something was wrong. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with a silence that did not belong to the land. Elias narrowed his eyes toward the creek bed where tall grass bent unnaturally. At first, he thought it was debris washed in by the recent rains, but then the shape shifted, barely, like a breath fighting to survive. His instincts took over before thought could catch up. He dismounted and moved closer, boots crunching softly against the dirt. There, lying half in the mud and half in the shallow water, was a young Apache girl. Her skin was pale from exhaustion, her dark hair tangled and stuck to her face. Cuts marked her arms, and her breathing was shallow, but steady enough to tell him she was alive. Elias had seen suffering before, plenty of it, but something about her stillness struck him deeper than any wound he had witnessed. For years, he had lived without interference, without involvement, but in that moment, distance felt like a lie he could no longer afford. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She stirred slightly, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. Elias hesitated only for a second before lifting her carefully, mindful of how light she felt, like the world had already begun to let her go. He settled her onto his horse and led the animal slowly back toward the ranch, his mind already racing with consequences he chose not to face yet. The ride back was quiet except for the creak of leather and the soft splash of hooves through shallow water. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, her eyes occasionally opening to the sky above, unfocused but aware. Elias avoided looking at her too long, afraid of what he might see reflected in her gaze. He told himself he was doing the right thing, though he had long forgotten what that truly meant. By the time they reached the ranch, darkness had begun to settle. Elias carried her inside his small cabin and laid her gently on the narrow bed he hadn't shared with another soul in more years than he cared to count. He built a fire, warmed water, and cleaned her wounds with a careful patience that surprised even him. His hands were steady, but his chest felt tight, like something long dormant was waking up and demanding attention. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in a chair near the bed, listening to the rise and fall of her breathing. Outside, coyotes called to one another, and the wind rattled the shutters. Every sound felt louder than it should have been, as if the world itself knew something had changed. Elias wondered how a single decision could undo years of deliberate isolation in a matter of hours. Morning came slowly. Pale light slipped through the window, touching the girl's face. Her eyes opened, dark and sharp despite her weakness, and they locked onto his instantly. Fear flashed there for just a moment, then something else Elias couldn't name. He raised his hands slightly, a silent gesture meant to reassure. "You're safe," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. She studied him carefully before nodding once. When she tried to sit up, pain tightened her features and she fell back against the pillow. Elias moved closer and offered her water. She drank in small sips, her hands trembling. She told him her name in a low voice, strong despite everything. It carried pride, history, and defiance all at once. Elias told her his in return, surprised at how strange it felt to say it out loud. Names had lost meaning in his world, but now they felt like bridges being built where none had existed before. Over the next few days, she grew stronger. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were precise and thoughtful. Elias learned that she had been separated from her people, taken by men who saw her as nothing more than something to trade. She escaped when their guard slipped, running until her strength failed, and the creek claimed what little energy she had left. She spoke without self-pity, as if survival itself was the only victory that mattered. Elias listened, anger tightening his jaw. He had spent years avoiding the cruelty of men by isolating himself, pretending it no longer existed. Hearing her story stripped that illusion away. He didn't promise her anything, didn't speak of justice or revenge, but something inside him hardened into resolve. The ranch changed with her presence. Silence no longer felt empty, it felt expectant. She spent long hours sitting near the window, watching the land as if committing it to memory. Sometimes Elias caught her tracing patterns in the dirt, symbols he did not understand but felt carried meaning far deeper than words. Though still weak, she insisted on helping where she could. Elias protested, but she ignored him, gathering small bundles of wood or sweeping the cabin floor. Her determination stirred something in him, a reminder of strength not born from force, but from endurance. He began to see her not as someone he had rescued, but as someone who had survived. Evenings became something Elias hadn't known he was missing. They sat on the porch as the sky burned orange and purple, sharing meals in companionable silence. One night she spoke again, her voice softer than before. She said loneliness could wound a person just as deeply as violence. The words struck him harder than any accusation ever could have. He stared out at the horizon, unsure how she had seen through him so clearly. He admitted, haltingly, that solitude had once felt safer than connection, that when you lose enough, you start believing emptiness is easier to carry than hope. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, understanding. As days turned into weeks, Elias found himself laughing quietly at small things, moments that would have once passed unnoticed. He felt time slowing, stretching into something meaningful instead of something to be endured. Yet beneath it all, an unease remained. He knew her people would search for her. He knew the peace he felt was fragile, borrowed, and temporary. One afternoon, with the wind restless and the sky unsettled, she asked him if he had ever grown used to being alone. The question lingered between them. Elias thought carefully before answering. He said loneliness becomes familiar. But that doesn't mean it stops hurting. She nodded, as if confirming something she had already known. That night the fire burned low as they sat inside, shadows dancing along the walls. The quiet felt different, heavier, charged with words left unspoken. She moved closer, her voice barely above a whisper, and said she had gone too long without kindness, without feeling seen. The admission was simple, but it carried the weight of everything she had endured. Elias swallowed hard, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He didn't move toward her, didn't cross the line he feared could not be uncrossed. Instead, he met her eyes and let the truth sit between them. In that moment, he understood that loneliness was not just the absence of people, but the absence of being understood. And for the first time in a very long while, he felt that absence begin to fade. The fire crackled softly between them, the kind of sound that usually filled empty space without meaning, but tonight it carried weight. Elias felt the tension in the room, not fear, not danger, but the fragile closeness that comes when two wounded lives brush against each other. He stood slowly and added another log to the fire, giving both of them a moment to breathe. When he turned back, the Apache girl was watching him with an honesty that made it impossible to look away. She spoke again, quietly, explaining that where she came from, silence was not emptiness. It was a place where truth waited. She said she had been alone for longer than she could remember, even when surrounded by people who claimed to own her. The words were not an invitation or a demand, but a confession. Elias nodded, understanding more than he could explain. He told her he would never take what was not freely given, that safety meant choice, and choice meant dignity. The relief in her eyes was immediate. That night they slept under the same roof, but in separate corners of the room, the distance between them small yet meaningful. For the first time in years, Elias dreamed. He dreamed of open land filled with laughter, of voices carried by the wind instead of swallowed by it. When morning came, he woke before dawn, unsettled but lighter, as if something long broken had been carefully set back into place. Days passed, and the world beyond the ranch slowly returned to their awareness. Elias noticed signs near the outer edge of his land, tracks that were not his own. The Apache girl noticed them too. She grew quieter, more watchful, her eyes scanning the horizon with a familiar alertness. One evening, she told Elias that her people would be near. She did not sound afraid, but she did sound uncertain. Elias felt a tightness in his chest he had not expected. He had prepared himself for her departure in theory, but now that it too loomed closer, the thought carried weight. He asked her what she wanted. The question surprised her. No one had asked her that in a long time. She said she wanted to return to her people, but not in chains, not as someone broken. She wanted to go back whole. When the Apache riders finally appeared at the edge of the land, Elias stepped out to meet them alone, hands open, movements slow. The tension was thick, old history pressing down on every breath. The girl came to stand beside him, her posture strong despite everything she had endured. She spoke to them in her own language, her voice steady and clear. The men listened. They saw her standing unafraid, unharmed, and their suspicion shifted into something closer to respect. Elias explained what he could in simple terms. He did not paint himself as a hero. He told the truth and left the rest to her. After a long moment, the oldest among them nodded. There was no gratitude spoken aloud, but there was acknowledgement, and in that world, it was enough. Before she left, she turned to Elias. There were no dramatic promises, no tears. She placed her hand over her heart, then over his. The gesture said what words could not. She had found safety here, and he had found connection. Neither would forget the other. As the riders disappeared into the distance, Elias stood alone again on his porch. But the loneliness was different now. It no longer felt endless. The land looked the same, the work still waited, and the nights would still be quiet. Yet something inside him had changed. He knew now that solitude was not the same as strength, and that even the most isolated lives could be touched, changed, and healed by a single moment of shared humanity. That evening, as the sun set and the wind moved through the grass, Elias allowed himself a small smile. The ranch was quiet once more, but it was no longer empty. As time moved on, Elias' life appeared unchanged on the surface, but inwardly he was no longer the same man. When he rose before sunrise, the familiar emptiness no longer greeted him the way it once had. While feeding the horses, repairing the fence, or walking the quiet stretches of his land, he sometimes remembered her voice, calm, steady, and strong enough to give meaning to silence. The memory did not bring pain. Instead, it stayed with him like a quiet warmth, a reminder that connection, even brief, could leave a lasting mark. Every so often, Elias found himself drawn back to the place near the creek where he had first seen her. The water still flowed, the grass still bent with the wind, but the ground itself felt different. It was no longer just a piece of land. It was a moment frozen in time, a turning point that taught him how quickly fate could change a life. He no longer avoided people the way he once had. He visited town on occasion, spoke less but meant more, and listened in ways he never had before. Far away, the Apache girl had returned to her people, but she too carried change within her. She was no longer defined by survival alone. There was dignity in her posture, confidence in her eyes. She knew there was a place in the world where she had been seen not as property or burden, but as a person. That knowledge became part of her strength, something no one could take from her again. This story does not end with promises or reunions. It ends with understanding. Sometimes life does not give us what we expect, but it gives us what reshapes us. And sometimes, a brief crossing of paths is enough to alter two lives forever.